I take it you've got lots of snow there, have you?
Well, you know, yesterday it got so warm that it was like 4 degrees and everything was melting. It got cold again today, but yeah, it was surprisingly warm. It's clearly, you know, talking to some people here, they've never seen it that warm this time of year.
Oh.
So it's a little scary.
Good morning, Gwyn.
Hi, Gwyn.
We're here in the south of England here. We haven't had any snow yet. They're been threatening us with it, but it hasn't arrived yet.
Oh,
In Hastings, snowing in St Leonard's.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh.
So it's coming to you, right?
They've been told it's coming to us, yes.
It's on its way, Derek, don't worry. It'll be in Sutton in about 25 minutes, I reckon. So first of all, can I just ask you all to please mute your microphones so that you don't get too much background noise.
How about video? How about bandwidth? Do you want us to stop our videos as well?
No, I think that should be okay. That's usually
okay.
Okay. So I would just like to say thank you so much to everyone for coming along today. It's really great to see so many people again. And thanks a million to Jay for agreeing to do this talk. We were just talking about the fact that the Rosetta Stone is so famous. You always see these crowds around it whenever you go to the British Museum. But not many people actually know what the story is on the Rosetta Stone. They just see it as the kind of lexicon, the kind of tool that helped the earliest Egyptologists decipher the hieroglyphs. So Jay's going to tell us all about that and his experience working on the archaeological remains of the 2 cities that the stone talks about. So Jay, I'll hand over to you now.
Right, we'll mute ourselves. Right?
Yes, please.
Hopefully we'll have time for questions afterwards. So again, I'm Jay Silverstein, and you can see the scene going on behind me. And I think one of the advantages of this pandemic is that we seem to have transcended the limitations of time and space. And so we can look at me and pretend I'm at the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC. And the Battle of Raphia is the climax of the 4th Syrian War between the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. And it's one of the biggest battles in ancient history, and the only one where you have Indian elephants, Asian elephants, fighting against African elephants, because there was an arms race going. And so when the Seleucids got Indian elephants, and Ptolemy ran down to Africa to pull some African elephants. But this battle, this 217 BC battle, this is going to be kind of a hinge point for the talk I want to talk about, which is this tale of 2 tells. So let me get my PowerPoint up here. Okay, everyone see that okay? Good, okay. So we're going to talk about rebellion and the Rosetta Stone. Now, the Rosetta Stone doesn't talk about these 2 tells that I'm going to talk about, but it talks about the rebellion. And what we're going to explore here today is the correlation between that rebellion discussed on the Rosetta Stone and the archaeological manifestation of that rebellion in at these 2 tells, and particularly the second tell, which will be the one of Timai. So if you think about the Nile Delta at this time period, now of course, currently there are only 3 branches of the Nile River going through the Delta, but in ancient times there were many more branches and tributaries of the Nile as it fingered its way towards the Mediterranean. And here it's color-coded so you can see the different nomes of Lower Egypt. So the 16th nome, the nome of Ka, the Mendesian nome, is the one we're interested in. And the 2 tells, of course, are right next to each other. One is Tel Aruba, or the ancient city of Mendes is the Greek name, or Tel Timai, which the ancient name was Thmouis. So if we just look at a satellite image, you can see Tel Aruba up here, Mendes, and then Tel Timai down here, Thmouis. And the distance between these is 500 meters or so. So these cities are right next to each other, 2 major cities by the Greco-Roman period. And so the question is, what was the dynamic going on between these 2 cities? And there's a bit of a mystery and a controversy that we're going to explore here. And one is, or this is, that Tel Aruba was extremely important throughout Egyptian history. One of the most important cities in Lower Egypt. But something happened during the Greco-Roman period where the capital of the Magnesium nome moved from Tel Aruba to Tel Thmouis. So what is the cause of that movement? So again, looking at the political landscape of the 28th dynasty of Egypt. So here, before the coming of Alexander the Great, 404 to 399 B.C.E. or so, Mendes served as the capital of all of Egypt. And that's the status that the city had. So this was the center of resistance against the Persian Empire. And it was one of the most important religious and political centers in Egypt. Just looking at the landscape of Mendes now, you can see it looks quite a bit, quite barren, but it's actually, there's major architecture. Here you can see just some of the mud brick architecture here with the post holes for the cross beams. And here you have a naos, and this is the largest naos in Egypt. So there would have been 4 of these forming a courtyard to 4 of the major deities of Egyptian mythology. This particular naos, the one that still survives today, was to the god Shu. And then the main cult god of Mendes was the ram god Badnebjet, similar to Khnum that you find in Upper Egypt, but this is the Lower Egypt manifestation of the god. And here you can see just some representations of the god. And here you can see a sarcophagus. And there are dozens of these sarcophagi around the site. And these would have been where the ram mummies would have been kept. Because just like the Apis bull cult that you see at Alexandria or in Memphis, that the sacred ram, when it died, would have been mummified and given the full ceremonial burial that a god animal would get. So all these sarcophagi would have kept the lineage of that ram deity family preserved and worshipped at Mendes. Now, if you compare that to Thmouis, and just looking at this landscape, you get a different feel of it. You don't see, the nails popping up like that, and you see these kind of very Greco-Roman columns laying around. You see this massive urban landscape of mud brick architecture. So here you have very much a city that represents a Greek or Roman style town, a polis, rather than a cult-based temple city that you find in Egypt, in the traditional Egyptian. Here, just an example of how well some of the streets are preserved when you walk down the streets of Timai. And of course, Timai is thriving as we get into the Christian period. And so this is what I believe is probably one of the earliest churches, surviving churches in the Delta, dating to the 4th or 5th century AD. So hopefully this season, if we get a season, we'll begin excavation and conservation. We've done some conservation on it to try and keep the mud brick up, but it's a rather impressive structure, and we'll begin to explore that Coptic history. So if we think about the Hellenistic period and how it manifests in Egypt, here's just a handful of artifacts that kind of give you an idea of the types of representations that we have. And you'll see a lot of aspects of sort of this Greco-Egyptian fusion and syncretism. I'll talk about that a little bit more. So here you can see the god Hippocrates, which is a manifestation of the god Horus, in a Hellenized version. Or here you can see Demeter sort of blended with Isis. And here is just a Roman lamp that would have been commemorating the visit of sub-Saharan acrobats that were acrobats coming out of Africa, traveling around the Mediterranean area during the Roman period, and we see traces of them. We have a feeling that they came to visit Thmouis probably in the 2nd century AD or so. You have that tradition, the fertility tradition blending some aspects of the Greek tradition, but really embracing a lot of the Egyptian tradition. So here you see the goddess Tuaret, or the god Bes, here in a militarized form. So gods and goddesses associated with fertility, protecting women who are pregnant, protecting children, very strongly represented in the Greco-Egyptian tradition. Now, these two cities had a lot of fame in the ancient world associated with the manufacture of perfume. So the best perfume in the Greco-Roman world during this period was called the Mendesian. It was manufactured at Mendes and Thmouis. And we have found some evidence for perfume manufacture at Mendes. That'll be a different talk, but I mentioned here because it does relate to some of the evidence of the rebellion that we're going to talk about. One of our colleagues in Germany has, using some of the textual information, reconstructed the Mendesian perfume. And so we actually have made the perfume, and we know what the Mendesian smells like. It's a beautiful perfume. There are two perfumes that were known there, one Metopian, one Mendesian. The Mendesian is very soft, myrrh-based perfume that's absolutely gorgeous. The Metopian is more musky, more masculine, I think. But we have reconstructed both those formulas, and we'll be doing some more work on that as well. So I mentioned that there was evidence of the perfume manufacturing going on. One of the pieces of evidence that we have is the presence of a large kiln complex. Now, the kiln complex, we're able to date it to the late Persian period, so just before Alexander the Great got there, maybe earlier, but we're not able to get any further evidence on it. But the kiln complex goes out of use by the end of the 3rd century. So by 200 or so, 185 B.C., this kiln complex gets shut down, and that becomes a bit of a mystery. What's going on? That they're producing these ceramics here for 150 years at least, and then they stop. So here you can see excavations going on at the kiln complex. A lot of these were salvage work. A lot of this area was designated for destruction, and Egyptian salvage archaeologists had come and opened up these pits, and so we came and cleaned them and collected data from them. And what we found, here again, how we're able to date it, that we are finding some imported Athenian ceramics. We also found imported clay. So clay that was used to make very fine perfume bottles, and at this point in history, they're making these little jug-shaped lekythoi or perfume oil bottles. And here we found 2 amphora with clay that was imported from 800 kilometers away from the south, from Upper Egypt, from the area around Edfu and Esna. So it suggests that the perfume bottle industry was well developed and that it was well connected. The amphora that they were using to transfer this clay was actually from the Aegean. So these were Cnidian amphora that were stuffed with clay from the south and then brought back to Timai, where that clay was used to make really fine perfume bottles, because it's a much finer fabric than the local Nile silk, which tends to be very coarse. So we have good evidence of the perfume bottle manufacturing going on at this kiln complex, both in the cruder Nile silk, but also in these finer bottles. Just showing you here, so here's where the amphora came from. It was Cnidian. And then here's where the clay came from. We did chemical sourcing on the clay to match it up, and we matched it up with the manufactured perfume bottles we had, the clay. And then, of course, here's Thmouis, where it all ended up. Just an example of the early perfume types of products. So here you can see like a little decanter and these little perfume bottles. So this is a late Persian assemblage, so dating to the late 5th century, or perhaps early 4th century. And then just an example that this perfume industry continued on. Here's just a fragment of a perfume bottle inventorium from the Roman period, where they moved from making these ceramic perfume bottles to glass perfume bottles. And here's just a piece of slag from the kiln that shows the same glass fabric in it, showing that it wasn't just an imported inventorium, that they were making these perfume bottles there at Timai. And we do have a perfume factory, which is really interesting. So again, exposed by the Egyptian salvage work. And we do have some analysis going on that. Again, as I mentioned, that's a different talk, but it's important to see it. And this particular factory seems to have fallen out of function around 60 BC. But below it, in the lower levels, there was another perfume factory that seems to have gone out of function about the same time that the kilns were shut down. So the perfume industry was certainly going throughout the 3rd century BC, and then part of it, at least the kiln complex that we've been looking at, was shut down by about 200. But the perfume manufacturing continued here at least until the time of Cleopatra. So my hunch about what happened here, because right next to this perfume factory, we found a hoard of silver coins and gold jewelry, is that when Cleopatra's father had been exiled from Egypt, that he was exiled to Rome with his daughter, Cleopatra VII. He made a deal with the Roman political powers there, and Pompey being one of them, and they hired a Roman general to reconquer Egypt from his older daughter. So they retook Egypt. He executed his older daughter, and then he executed a lot of the nobles who had supported her in rebelling against him, and he took their money because he needed to gather a lot of their wealth. So I suspect that this perfume factory was probably shut down based on the coins that we found there, dating to that same period, which is about 58 BC, when Ptolemy XII returned to Egypt. That perhaps this perfume manufacturer or merchant was caught up in that purge. He'd supported Cleopatra's older sister, and so he was on the wrong side of history when Ptolemy XII returned with his daughter Cleopatra VII. Then she later, of course, assumed control of Egypt and had her particular relations with the Roman Empire. So what happened after that, we don't know. Of course, we're missing the upper levels, but we do have an interesting snapshot into the perfume industry and the politics, maybe that surrounded being a wealthy perfume merchant in Tel Timai. But we're going to go back to that 200 BC, the closing down of the lower perfume factory and the kiln complex. So if we look at the history that's leading up into that, so again, the Persian period, they come back after being kicked out. The leaders, the pharaoh from Mendes, and the other pharaohs from that region, from the 28th to the 30th dynasty, kick the Persians out. The Persians come back with a vengeance. They take it out on Mendes pretty hard. Here, as they're coming into Egypt again, the siege of Pelusium became kind of legendary in history because the Persians carried cats into battle. And so here you can see the Persians carrying the cats and then flinging them at the Egyptians, because they knew that the Egyptians viewed the cat as sacred, so they wouldn't shoot arrows at them if they were carrying a cat. And so they carried the cats as protection from the Egyptians, and then flung them as they besieged Pelusium, and then they moved on down to Mendes, conquering Mendes, impaling people, destroying the harbors there, taking statues of the god away, and doing a lot of devastation at Mendes. Enter Alexander the Great, the hero, right? So he sweeps the Persians, of course, away, coming through Anatolia, through Syria, through the Levant, and then coming down to Egypt in 332 BC. and he's greeted as a liberator. So you look at the course of Alexander, and he comes down, and then comes right into Egypt. Now he does a little funny detour in Egypt, which kind of sets the tone for the Hellenistic period to follow, and the Ptolemaic Empire to follow in Egypt. And that's he takes a visit over to the Siwa Oasis. So here we see the Siwa Oasis, and there is the oracle to the god Amun. And he visits this oracle, and the oracle reveals to him that actually he's the son of Amun, just as his mother had recognized or had let him know that he was the son of Zeus, not just Philip, but also Zeus. He's also the son of Amun. And so you see a fusion of the god Zeus and Amun to create Zeus Amun. And you see this in the coins from the time period. So here you can see Alexander the Great on the coin, and you can see that he's got the horns of Amun on him. So here you can see the horns of Amun on this gold coin, again showing up here, the ram horn over here. So you have this manifestation of Zeus Amun. So it's this fusion of the Greek tradition and the Egyptian tradition, this syncretism. And of course, this was brilliant and fortunate or manufactured on Alexander's part, because it establishes his lineage as having divine legitimacy to rule Egypt as a pharaoh. Alexander, of course, moves on, heads to India, ends up dying in Babylon. But the tradition of Zeus Amun stays of this fusion of the lead of the pantheon of the Greeks and the head of the pantheon of the Egyptians. But it goes through even more metamorphosis and more syncretism between the Greek and the Egyptian traditions. So after Alexander the Great dies, his general Ptolemy grabs Egypt for his own and eventually establishes himself as pharaoh after Alexander the Great's son is murdered. So Ptolemy builds on that creating a divine legitimacy for Macedonian rule in Egypt. So he takes what Alexander started, and he capitalizes on it in a very structured way. And so you see the birth of a new god, or the embracing of a god. There may have been some aspects of this god already in existence from Greek settlers who had settled into Egypt before Alexander the Great. But Ptolemy takes it and really runs with it. And so you see the creation of the god Serapis. And you can see he kind of carries some of the aspects of Zeus Amun, but more importantly is the connection with the Apis bull, the cult of Osiris. So Serapis, you see that he becomes a benevolent god. He's associated with fertility here with Ammonius for grain storage on his head. And here you can see he also carries the attributes of Zeus and of Hades, here with his dog Cerberus, the three-headed dog, the guardian of the underworld in Greek tradition. And then he takes on also the aspect of his consort, his sister, wife, who it really retains mostly the identity of the goddess Isis. You'll find her mixed with Aphrodite and Demeter and others, but she always maintains, because Isis was such a powerful character, such a benevolent goddess within the Egyptian tradition, and so powerful, associated with the Nile flood and resurrection, that tradition hangs on. And so Isis becomes very powerful. And in some ways later on, in the Roman period, that I would say it was kind of a contest whether the Roman world was going to worship Isis versus Christianity. That her cult was extremely strong and appreciated, and it spread throughout the Roman Empire to England, of course. And then their child is very important also. So Hippocrates, or the incarnation of Horus, the young pharaoh, the baby pharaoh who grows up to be, at maturation and death, Osiris. So here you can see a very Greek rendition with the Egyptian crown, lower and upper Egypt, but but the very symbol of you know, the young pharaonic incarnation of the god Horus. So here you have this new syncretic pantheon that's shaped under the Ptolemaic rule, and this pantheon, of course, becomes extremely powerful, influential, and just some more examples of it. And here you can even see the river Nile portrayed in a very Roman sense of a river god. And that's Hippocrates there. But these cults spread out throughout the Ptolemaic Empire. Of course, the Ptolemaic Empire is spreading out into the Aegean, into Anatolia, to Cyprus, and then constantly feuding with the Seleucid Empire, the other of the Hellenistic empires, where the general Seleucus had claimed Syria and Persia. So these cults carry on, and so the cult of Serapis can be found in Rome. Isis can be found in Rome. There's a temple of Isis at Pompeii, where very well preserved example of one of her shrines. We find a cult to Serapis, a temple to Serapis in Delos. So with the empire went the imperial religion. So Ptolemaic Egypt, this Hellenistic period in Egypt, is considered, I think, one of the great enlightenments of humanity. And so the accomplishments there, you find two of the wonders of the world at Alexandria. So here you see the lighthouse of Alexandria, you know, legendary. And of course, the library of Alexandria, also legendary. And these were begun, you know, constructions that were conceived of and begun under Ptolemy I. So you're seeing kind of the best of the ancient world, what the ancient world had to offer, history and intellectualism, and the development of science and the humanities going on in Ptolemaic Egypt. Now, Mendes was not left out of this new relationship between the Egyptians and the Greeks. And so here we have the Mendes stela from the time of Ptolemy II. Now, Ptolemy II comes to Mendes and he participates in the annual ritual associated with the ram god Badnebjedet. And so here you can see just relief from the top part of the stela. So you can see the pharaoh, Ptolemy II, with the ram god here. And it goes in to describe his participation, going out on the boats with the procession, the sacred procession of the ram god, as it would travel to other temples in the area. And then he also asks that a temple be erected to his queen, Arsinoe II, who had passed away and is then becomes deified and associated with the goddess Isis. So his queen and his sister, just as Serapis is married to his sister Isis, the pharaoh traditionally would marry his sister, who would become the queen. So Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II, king and queen, brother and sister rulers of Egypt. With her death, then he goes on to the reification of her to build a temple dedicated to her at the Mendes Thmouis, urban area. He also does things like help pay for reparations for damages that were done when the Persians reconquered Egypt, recapturing some of the statues that had been taken away and bringing them back to Mendes, helping to fix walls and giving them some tax relief. So helping, really working with the priests of Mendes to establish that relationship between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the priest complex, which was a real power source within ancient Egypt. So here you can see some cult statues of Arsinoe as goddess Isis. You can recognize that as the goddess Isis by the knot. And so this is one that was found at Tel Timai. This is one that was found in the harbor of Alexandria. Very much the same style. This is the typical style of statue that you would have at any major temple to Arsinoe Isis. There's a couple of famous mosaics from Thmouis that depict Arsinoe with a ship on her head. Very much associated with it was a maritime empire. They spread their power through their navy. The lighthouse was associated with the goddess Isis, Isis Varos, and therefore Arsinoe was also associated with it. And as the cultic tradition of Isis spread with the Ptolemaic Empire through the Mediterranean, she became kind of a patron goddess to sailors and to merchants who were traveling the Mediterranean Sea. So you can see that this 3rd century BC, from the conquest of Alexander the Great to Ptolemy II, is looking pretty good in Egypt. We're seeing some really amazing things occurring. It always left me with a kind of a warm feeling of what humanity's capable of. But maybe that's kind of a naive feeling, right? Because maybe things weren't so great in Hellenistic Egypt. It's great if you're the controlling people, right? If you're the Greeks and you're suddenly come to this very rich land and you're able to exploit that land and do everything you want. But for the people who are living there, maybe things aren't quite as good. So again, we were talking about that movement from this temple complex at Mendes, right? This traditional temple that had thrived and controlled the Mendesian nome for 2,000 years, that suddenly during the Hellenistic period, all the power starts to siphon away over to Thmouis. And the traditional or accepted hypothesis for this movement was that the Nile River had drifted. And so that the harbor over here at Mendes had silted up, and therefore people started using the harbor here, and then that created an economic hub at Thmouis. We know when Titus sailed his army to Jerusalem in 60 AD, that he talks about sailing to Thmouis, getting off the ships there, and then walking to Jerusalem with his army to put down the Jewish revolt. So he talks about the harbor of Thmouis, not of Mendes. Now that could just be terminology, but it seems pretty clear at this point that Thmouis or Thmouis had become the dominant city within the Mendesian nome, and that Mendes had been pushed to the background and was not the center of political or economic or even religious center for the nome any longer. So the question is, what happened there? I was never comfortable with this idea that it was just a random drift of the city, that after 2,000 years of the Nile River feeding the harbor at Mendes, that it suddenly stopped. That the hydraulic engineering during this period was just too good. At this point, they were opening up the whole Fayum. They were digging canals across Egypt. That they certainly had the technology to keep a harbor open, to dredge it, and to keep that harbor working if they wanted to. So to me, it suggests that there was something else going on between Mendes and Thmouis that led to this change of this power relationship. So working in the northern part of Thmouis, this is a magnetometer survey. This is a early Roman temple built during the period of Augustus. But the magnetometer survey showed us a lot of architecture in this northern area. Here you can see these little salvage excavations. This is the area where we see those kilns. But we can see that there were house complex and different structures going on here. So we want to understand what was going on in this northern part of Thmouis. Again, the Kiln Complex, which had been truncated and cut off, and then it was leveled over, and then they constructed on top of it. So, and that happened, we could say, right around 200 BC, or between 175 and 200 BC. So that was kind of a first clue that there was something had happened in the northern part of Thmouis. It's another view of the kilns. You can see how regularly they were just kind of cut off. This just shows the extent of the kiln complex. These little circles are all kilns. And we're going to take a look over here at this complex over here. This was a house dating to the Hellenistic period. One of the things that happens is we start finding weapons in this period of the shutting down of the kilns. So weapons, particularly consisting of a lot of these ballista stones that are shot from these kind of crossbow artillery, as well as one good example of an iron arrowhead. And then we started finding bodies. Now, finding unburied bodies in this layer tells you something, right? Because Egyptians and Greeks took care of their dead unless something happened. So here you can see there's a body of a young man that's tossed on top of one of the kilns. It's very poor preservation, sadly. Here was the skull that was just tossed into a rubbish pile. So we have this truncation event where those kilns are cut off. And then we see that there's a cleanup that goes on where they kind of push a lot of rubbish off into piles, and there's human remains mixed in the rubbish. And then we began to find burning and artifacts left in place. So these are all archaeological indicators of a destruction event. And the bodies and the weapons, of course, indicate a violent destruction event. This fellow, his remains kind of scattered within this destruction event layer. He's interesting because he was a man about my age, and you can see that his left arm here had been broken when he was young, and it had healed with a very thick callus, probably limiting the ability for him to even twist that arm a little bit, you know, maybe fusing those two bones together with the connective tissue that would have been in here. What's interesting about it is that it was broken again and not healed when he died. So when your left arm gets broken here, that's often referred to in forensics as a perifracture, because that's a defensive wound. You tend to use your left arm to protect, particularly in ancient warfare where you'd be carrying a shield. But it's a common wound to find on warriors from early combat. So this man who died probably around my age, in his 50s, late 50s or 60 or so, would have been a young man about the same time as the Battle of Raphia, interestingly. So when he was a young man, at some point he had his arm broken. When he died, it looked like he died fighting also and had his arm broken again. So again, I mentioned that Hellenistic house. So here you can see the magnetometer survey of the house, and here's the archaeological excavation. Now, what we found in that house was, on the bottom of the floor, was a small hoard of coins. It had been in a little, probably a leather bag. And those coins were able to help us date this destruction layer. So the last of these coins dates to the reign of Ptolemy IV, so about 204 BC. So we know that we have a terminal date for what was going on here. That we have coins from Ptolemy II, Ptolemy III, and Ptolemy IV present. We found a nice assemblage of ceramics on the floor. So here you can see this room in that house. The ceramics had a very distinctive Greek-style bell-shaped crater that went out of use in about 175 BC. So now we're starting to put our destruction layer to between 175 and 200 or 204, which happens to correspond with this event called the Great Rebellion in Egypt. So here you can see that our destruction layer is sandwiched on the upper layer where we have that leveling and reconstruction. You have a coin here from Ptolemy V or VI, dating 180 to 170, and then the lower layers consistently giving us a date from 175 or earlier. So we talked that things look pretty nice in Egypt, and that that the Hellenistic period was this kind of period of enlightenment. But was it as nice as we tend to think of when we think of the Library of Alexandria and all the accomplishments of the Hellenistic and Ptolemaic period? Well, I think one of the best stories that you find in a papyrus is this one, and I'll read this to you. So it's ethnic tension within Egypt is what I titled it. But to King Ptolemy, greeting from Heraclides, originating from Alexandros Isle, now residing in the Crocodiliopolis, in the Arsinoite Nome. I am wronged by Xenobastus, who lives in Psya, in the aforesaid Nome. On Phan-Menoth 21 of the year 5 in the fiscal calendar, I went to Psya in the said Nome on a personal matter. As I was passing by the house of an Egyptian woman, whose name is said to be Xenobastus, she leaned out of a window and emptied a chamber pot of urine over my clothes so that I was completely drenched. So here's this Greek woman, as you can tell from her name, walking through the town, and an Egyptian woman takes a chamber pot of urine from a second-story window and dumps it on top of her. Maybe it was an accident, but the document goes on to them getting into a fight and her clothes getting ripped. And she files a lawsuit against the Egyptian woman. You could say that this is a one-off, but I don't think it is. I think this is kind of typical and representative of tensions that were between the Greeks and the Egyptians at the time period. And this puts it at a very personal level, but we have lots of examples of the Egyptians feeling very put on, from that initial enthusiasm of the liberation of Alexander, that the exploitation of the Greeks who were now flooding into Egypt to take advantage of the agricultural lands and the economic opportunities, that the Egyptians had become a second-class people within their own land. So they weren't as enthused as they once were when Alexander the Great liberated them from the Persians to now be under this foreign dynasty. So I started off with still have it going behind me, the elephants in the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC. As I mentioned, that one man with the broken arm, that it could be that first break would date to about the time period of 217 BC. Now the Battle of Raphia was at a time when there's a lot of warfare going on in the Mediterranean world, and there was a race to try and recruit mercenaries and to build an army big enough to, for Ptolemy to defeat the Seleucid army. So one of the things that he did was he turned to the Egyptians and he armed them. Now the Egyptians had a strong military tradition. There were a military caste of warriors, but in general, the Greeks did not like to mobilize them or use them as part of their army, because obviously they were subjugating these people, and they didn't want to arm them and train them to fight. But for the Fourth Syrian War, Ptolemy IV made the decision to arm the Egyptians. And so Polybius tells us the consequence of that. He says, as for Ptolemy, his war against the Egyptians followed immediately on these events. So he's talking about the rebellion. This king, by arming the Egyptians for this war against Antiochus, took a step which was of great service for the time. So by arming the Egyptians, he armed 20,000 Egyptians and brought them to war against the Seleucids, and they won the battle, but which was a mistake as regards the future. The soldiers, highly proud of their victory at Raphia, were no longer disposed to obey orders, but were on the lookout for a leader and a figurehead, thinking themselves well able to maintain themselves as an independent power, an attempt in which they finally succeeded not long afterwards. They succeeded in the form of the Great Rebellion, where they established their own dynasty in Upper Egypt, the Thebaid dynasty. So that there was an Egyptian pharaoh at the same time that Ptolemy IV's son, Ptolemy V, was in charge of Egypt, just a child. And so you had two pharaohs, one Egyptian, one Greek, and they entered into a 20-year war from about 204, 206 to 186 BC. So the war kind of spread around Egypt. So you had the Egyptians based out of Thebes and then also into Abydos, and they had help from the Nubians as well, who had allied themselves with the Egyptians. And then in the Delta, you had some aspect of this rebellion going on also, where the heart of the Delta seems to have been taken by the rebels, by the Egyptians. I suspect, as we're going to see, that Mendes was part of that rebellion. So they had, they had that visit from Ptolemy II, as we saw in the Mendes stela, kind of cementing the relationship. But sometimes when you make a visit like that, you're doing it because there's tension there, and you're trying to find a way to mitigate that tension, to make some accessions to the priests, such as helping them rebuild the temple. But what we find is that after the rebellion, there was no more help from the Ptolemies at that temple. That all ceased after the rebellion. So that Mendes stela, which looks like it's a cementing of a relationship, may actually be an indication of tensions that they were trying to find some relief to those tensions by creating a stronger relationship. Whatever, in 200 BC, things blew up in Egypt and the rebellion took hold. So we see one aspect of the rebellion at the Temple of Osiris in Abydos, 199 BC, where the rebels held up in the Temple of Seti I to Osiris. And we have evidence here of what happened just because we have graffiti from both sides. So the Egyptians wrote graffiti on the walls, and then when the Greeks eventually won the battle in 199, that they also wrote graffiti on the walls. And so we have evidence of what was going on there in what was probably one of the biggest and most important battles. One of the Egyptian pharaohs seems to be killed here and is succeeded by his son. So there were a total of 3 Egyptian pharaohs during this period. 2, I think, dying in battle, and 1 kind of disappearing after the end of the rebellion. So it's led me to ponder, and there's no real supporting evidence of this, but again, we look at that tension, that syncretism from the Egyptian cult of Osiris to the building of the god and the cult of Serapis. Maybe the priests of Osiris weren't as content with that new relationship and those new temples of Serapis, which were appearing at major Hellenistic economic centers like Alexandria, places where there were mines, where there were economic activities, and as I said, even up to Rome, but they weren't necessarily reaching out to the common Egyptians. They tend to be at these Hellenistic centers rather than the Egyptian centers. So the priests of Osiris were all still there, and now they find that Osiris had kind of been stolen or borrowed or blended into this new Greek pantheon. So it's led me to wonder that if the priests of Osiris, who Neb-Jedid was very close with, associated with the nearby site of Busiris, the lower Egyptian center for Osirian worship, along with Sais, that maybe the priests of Osiris were some of the instigators of this rebellion, that they were looking for a way to get rid of the Greeks. That's my own personal hypothesis. No one's talked about it before that I know of. Now, the Rosetta Stone. We talked about the Rosetta Stone. Of course, it became a symbol of the lexicon. We know it well from Egyptology and the deciphering of hieroglyphics. And of course, it's embedded in our culture. Here, Rosetta Stone learning software for teaching you Klingon, for instance. So we think when we say Rosetta Stone, we don't think of the content of the stone as much as the role that the stone played in deciphering hieroglyphs, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning of the talk. But if we look at some of the text on the Rosetta Stone, then there's quite a bit there. So it begins with kind of standard salutations to King Ptolemy, again referring to this child king Ptolemy V, who's now, when the Rosetta Stone is written in 196 BCE, just becoming a teenager. So there's a passage in there that says, he went to the fortress of Shechem, or in the Greek it was Lycopolis, which had been fortified by the rebels with all kinds of work, there being much gear and all kinds of equipment within it. He enclosed that fortress with a wall and a dike around it because of the rebels who were inside, who had already done much harm to Egypt and abandoned the way of the commands of the king and the commands of the gods. He caused the canals which supplied water to that fortress to be dammed off, although the previous kings could not have done likewise. Much money was expended on them. So we have on the Rosetta Stone an admiration for the king's military ability, working with his Greek mercenaries and generals, to conquer this fortress of Shechem, which is a subject town within the nome adjacent to the Magnesium nome. That's where the nome capital there is Osiris, as I mentioned, one of the centers of Osirian worship. So here on the Rosetta Stone in 196, this decree, is a Memphis decree, is about King Ptolemy V now being of age to be fully recognized by the gods as pharaoh. And so that's the main purpose of this decree. And at the bottom of the decree, it says, have it etched on hard stone and put in every city. So there'd be many Rosetta Stones scattered throughout Egypt. And that's why they wrote it in 3 scripts, including the Greek, so that everybody could read it. But among the things in it is this discussion of his victories against the rebels, because it's trying to convince people to drop their arms, stop the rebellion, and come back to worship, to the Ptolemaic dynasty. So within it are grants of amnesty. If you stop fighting, we'll give you back your lands. We'll reduce taxation. We'll stop forcing people to join the military, or taking priests to force them to work in our navy. So it makes all sorts of promises, so it's a statement of, look, I'm going to win. I'm more powerful than you. I'm now pharaoh, and I've got the support of the priests of Ptah in Memphis. And if you do stop fighting, then I'll work with you to try and make things better. And it goes on to say a couple other things which I'll mention here shortly. So the rebellion does come to an end, but 10 years after the Rosetta Stone. So it wasn't very effective in convincing people to stop fighting. So the end is a bit dramatic, and we do have a nice account of it from Polybius again, where he says, when Polycrates got the rebels into his power, for Atinus, Osiris, Chasuphus, and Irobastus, so all Egyptian names, these are the Egyptian rebel chieftains who are left. The surviving chieftains, forced by circumstances, came to Sais, again, major city that had been presumably recaptured by the Ptolemies in the Nile Delta, to entrust themselves to the king in king's good faith. But Ptolemy, violating his faith, tied them in naked to carts, and after dragging them through the streets and torturing them, put them to death. On reaching Naucratis with his army, when Aristonicus had presented to him the mercenaries he had raised in Greece, he took them and sailed off to Alexandria, having taken no part in any action of the war owing to the unfairness of Polycrates. So here the war is going on. They're still recruiting mercenaries. So Ptolemy V has arranged for this other general to arrive and help with the war, but the war has come to an end. The chieftains come and surrender, are murdered. And the new general who's coming from Greece, he sees what's going on, and it's just like, he loses all respect for the Ptolemaic dynasty, and says, I'm taking my troops and going back home. I'm not going to work for someone who murders people who surrender in good faith. Which is interesting just when you think about the morality of warfare and rebellion, and the relationship again between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Egyptians. So looking at just the geography of some of these places that we just talked about, here of course are Mendes and Thmouis. Here's Osiris, and somewhere here, we don't know the actual site that's described on Rosetta Stone of Shechem or the Lycopolis, but it's somewhere within this nome, so it's somewhere in this area right here. And then Sais, where the chieftains come to surrender and are executed. So something else that's on the Rosetta Stone, and that statue should be set up for King Ptolemy. So he commands that every temple must have a statue to him so that he's worshipped alongside the main god of that temple. And it should be made possible for the private persons also who so wish to produce the likeness of the shrine of the manifest god whose excellence is fine, Ptolemy V, which is discussed above, and to keep it in their homes and hold the festivals and processions which are described above each year. So he mandates that the temples all have a shrine to him. And then he says, you can have a shrine in your home also if you want to me. And you can have like a little statue of me and build a little shrine in your home, and you can worship me, every month and pay homage to me. So here you can see how the divine and the political have overlapped completely into legitimizing and reinforcing the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Here we found at Timai a small statue, a small terracotta head of what would probably be one of these domestic statues that you would have in your home for your little shrine. And so again, it was tossed into the garbage of that cleanup after the destruction of about 186 B.C.E. or at Thmouis. So again, you see that description on the Rosetta Stone, and then you find this little figurine that would have fit the type of shrine that's being talked about on the Rosetta Stone. So what are the consequences of all this? Is that the harbor silted up at Mendes, yeah, but maybe based on the violence that we've seen at Timai, that Mendes and Timai were caught up in this rebellion, that the Greek army and navy came there, destroyed both cities, and then they leveled Timai and began constructing a new Greek city there. And that Greek city began to take the authority away from Mendes, the authority that Mendes had held for 2,000 years. Now the economic center, the political center, with a growing group of temples associated with the new pantheon of gods in Egypt, the syncretic gods showing up at Thmouis. And so by the time you get into the Roman period, Mendes is kind of just a backwater of the Mendesian nome, and Thmouis is the center of authority and wealth within the nome. And here you can see just by the 6th century on the Madaba map in Jordan, so at the monastery in Jordan, you have a map of the world, of the known world at that time. And here you can see on the Nile Delta that Thmouis, I know it's hard to read on the mosaic, but Thmouis is referenced there, not Mendes, and it's shown as a major city, and it's talked about by several Roman authors as well. And what happens to Banebjedet? Well, he doesn't do well in history either. It seems that by the time you get to the Middle Ages, through the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, maybe with the legends that the Crusaders bring back, that he kind of seems to morph into an incarnation of the devil with Baphomet. And so that ram god, has this association with more nefarious forces. So going back from that Battle of Raphia that I talked about, and we see this chain of events and this destruction at Tel Timai and the correlates with the Rosetta Stone, that we begin to assemble a picture of a history that's otherwise pretty much unknown, I think, within the Nile Delta and within the Hellenistic tradition of Egypt. With that, I will end it, and if there's time, I'll be glad to answer any questions. So thank you all for your attention, and certainly an honor to be able to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Jay. That was absolutely amazing. That was the most incredible amount of information. I can't believe it. I really urge you all, when I do upload this onto YouTube, to share it with people, because I think hardly anybody knows this story. It's fantastic, and I'll never look at the Rosetta Stone in the same way.
Good. I think that's
so I just wanted to bring up before I forget, is it Dora Goldsmith that's working on the perfume stuff in Germany? Okay, yeah. So because I read an article about it was one of Cleopatra's favorites, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, of course we don't know that. Cleopatra wrote a book on cosmetics, which would have included perfume. It was a medicinal book. Perfume in Egypt was not just something for smelling nice. It was, or for romance. It was actually medicinal, and so that smells were very important to your health and for regulating, your humors. And actually, I've been working with a chemist also in Egypt, and he's been showing that some of the microbial properties, antimicrobial properties of the perfume are real.
Yeah.
The structure of the chemicals would actually help protect you from bacteria.
Yeah.
As well.
Things
So
like
it's not,
frankincense and myrrh, I should imagine, are very healthful.
yeah, and those are some of the prime ingredients that you find in the perfume. Not, I mean, the formulas are fairly complex, but myrrh, the Magnesium, as I mentioned, myrrh is the one of the prime sources of the fragrance within the myrrh. And there were many perfumes. The Temple of Edfu has a whole room dedicated to the manufacture of perfume, and it includes all the formulas and measurements and
Wow.
and how you
And I
harvest
guess
it.
you have like a divine element as well, with the god of perfume being Nefertiti,
Well,
things like
that's
that.
right. And if you even look at the Osirian tradition, when Isis finds the body of Osiris embedded within the architecture, within a tree in Lebanon, the first thing she does is she anoints his body with perfume. And so the whole mummification process is controlling some of these humors and these odors using these perfumes as well. So perfume, it fights that stench of decay. It is life-giving against anything that would harm life.
Yeah,
so it's very powerful.
We had a talk with Ramadan Hussein recently, and he was talking about the 7 sacred oils, because he found the mummification workshop and they found like some details about the mummification process that were pretty unusual, and that they
discovery. Ramadan's work is fantastic.
Yeah, that was just so interesting. I can't believe how fascinating that was. I feel like it was a real shame that we didn't start worshipping Isis instead of Christianity, frankly.
I think the world might be a better place.
I know there's a temple to Isis in London even, so, and Isis and, well, not so much Isis, but Serapis certainly kind of came through with Mithraism as well, which was all over.
Yeah, there was a bit of blending there too, I think, as well. We do have an article on perfume with myself and Robert Lippman and Dora and Sean, who also worked on it, coming out in the Journal of Near Eastern Archaeology in September. So it just passed peer review, so it will be published this year.
Excellent. I want to get myself some of that Magnesium perfume. It sounds good.
Dora does sell it.
Have a look. Because I did buy some Kifi. From actually Etsy has a thriving trade in ancient perfume recipes, I've noticed.
Really?
There's a few people.
I can't say much about it, but I can tell you that this year there will be some amazing discoveries revealed about Kifi.
Ooh, interesting. Oh, come on. What sort of amazing discoveries you wrote about?
Can't say anything yet.
Oh, damn it. Does anyone else have any other questions? This was like so incredible. I really hope that, I'm sure lots and lots of other people will watch this, and I'll try to share it with British museum groups, for example, and places like that.
Sure.
Because I just think that people should really know what is written on the Rosetta Stone. Gwyneth asks, there must be an English translation of the Rosetta Stone somewhere. Is there a particularly good one that you can recommend?
There's a couple of good ones on the web. If I can pull a link to it. There's one by Budge, which is not so good, but there's a better one of the Demotic, which is quite good, from atlas.org. So I'll post a link right here on the.
I mean, even the fact that there are many Rosetta Stones is incredible. I don't think many people knew that there were lots of them that were placed all over Egypt. That's fascinating in itself.
Okay, so I put in the chat the link to a good translation of the Rosetta Stone from the Demotic section. So yeah, I think there has been one other fragment of a Rosetta Stone found, but we haven't found the others. My partner at Thmouis, Robert Lippman, his dream is to find a Rosetta Stone there, but I think that at that time that my hunch is that Timai was still under rebel hands, so it probably would not have got a Rosetta Stone.
Mm.
But certainly places like Memphis and Alexandria, maybe in Abydos, Pelusium, Sais, if Sais was under Greek control at that point, would have probably got copies of Rosetta Stone, I would think.
Right, Asta asks, in one of the maps on two main temples entered the rebellion, a photo of the lighthouse at the Taposiris Magna was shown. Did the temple of Isis and Osiris at Taposiris Magna, was that involved in the events or the rebellion?
I don't know what the involvement of Taposiris Magna. I imagine that's because it was so embedded within the Alexandrian realm of influence, so close to Alexandria. That Taposiris Magna, which had a major temple of Isis also, would have been well under Greek control throughout the entire rebellion. And of course, you're probably familiar. There were just some very neat Hellenistic tombs discovered there.
Yeah, I know it's one of the sort of more contentious sites for the tomb of Cleopatra as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not convinced of that, but it's still a very important Hellenistic site, and it does have that monument that's a mock-up, a miniature of the lighthouse.
Yeah, I didn't realize even that the lighthouse was associated with Isis. That's really interesting. I feel like maybe I should go and start worshipping at the Temple of Isis in London to just reinstate the Isis religion.
It's probably not a bad idea, actually. If you look at some of the coins that show the lighthouse of Alexandria, you'll often see it depicted with Isis Pharos, kind of. I don't know if I had one included here. I don't think I did. But often, if you look at any sort of Ptolemaic coin or Roman coin with the lighthouse of Alexandria, not Ptolemaic, the Roman coin, with the lighthouse of Alexandria, oftentimes you'll see the goddess Isis at Pharos as kind of like the wind with the lighthouse. So she's protecting the sailors who would be sailing, the sea there. So that's a common depiction. And then you see those mosaics of Arsinoe with the ship on her head, which are quite phenomenal, really. Originally, those were identified as Berenike, Ptolemy I's wife, but that was a misidentification. And Catherine Blouin did an analysis of it, and I think quite convincingly made the case for those actually representing Arsinoe rather than Berenike. Reminds
me of the sanctuary of the great gods in Samothrace, the idea of the gods there being associated with the protection of mariners, and that's quite a ancient Greek religious idea. There's some of the earliest gods there.
Yeah, I think anyone who sailed on the seas looked for whatever protection they could get because it was a iffy proposition.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Jay? Derek asks, in the excavation of the perfumery, the deeper pit, a water level was shown. Is this modern or was it part of the manufacturing process?
The water level is about a meter, and in that northern part of the tell is about a meter below the surface. We haven't had much luck or seen much below them, so I don't know that there was much occupation beyond them. In ancient times, I don't know where the water table would have been, but it seems that our occupation in that northern area really does begin maybe in 450 or 500. The first reference to Thmouis as a city is by Herodotus in the 6th century, and he just refers to it as a colony of warriors, a warrior caste of Egyptians living at that town, living at Mendes and other towns in that region. And I think those are the people who led the rebellion against the Persians. So Thmouis was, I think, just developing as a town at this point. It had probably been nothing more than a subject village to Mendes for most of Egyptian history. And then as you get into the late period, that it starts to develop more and more, and then the Greek influence, the growth of the perfume industry, things like that began to increase the settlement at Thmouis to the point where, of course, by the Roman period, it's by far the dominant city.
Is there evidence of the export of those perfumes to many areas outside of Egypt?
Only textual evidence written by Greek authors. I'm not aware of anyone actually finding perfume bottles. Would probably be the thing that you would find, Magnesium perfume bottles. But that's probably more a factor of ignorance of it. I mean, we have published one article on these perfume bottles and the sourcing of the clays, but was the really fine bottles made with that imported clay were really a limited manufacturing. It seems to have been just, I think we only found 3 or 4 examples of them out of perhaps 3 tons of ceramics.
Wow.
So it's and the Nile silt ones would be hard to distinguish probably from any other bottle manufactured in the Nile Delta. So part of it is it would be the lack of data and comparative analysis and people looking for it. It's like this destruction layer. I suspect that there are many cities in the Delta that were destroyed in the same time period, but if archaeologists isn't attuned to picking up on it, you'll dig right through it and not realize it. You start to put all the pieces together, and I was skeptical at first. First we had those kilns that were truncated, then we had burning, and then the burning was appearing over a couple hundred meters of area. Then you had things left in place, then you had bodies. And in fact, the guy with the broken arm, I said, if we really had a good destruction layer here, we would have a dead body, in the ruins. And I was walking through the Egyptian excavations and I saw a bit of bone sticking out, and I thought, oh, it could be human bone. So I put someone to excavate it, and it turned out to be this guy with 2 perifractures. It was exactly what I would expect if I had a violent destruction layer. And then when we were looking through the leveling layer, we were able to find matching ceramic sherds found about 80 meters apart from the same vessel. So it suggested that when they were leveling the site for reconstruction, that they were tapping into a garbage heap of broken ceramics, and that this one vessel was used in the same leveling event 80 meters apart. So that suggests it was all one episode of leveling, rather than someone reconstructing here, 50 years later, reconstructing here, that someone came in with a plan and leveled everything to reconstruct the city.
Linda asks, can you explain a little bit more about the sort of transition from the ram god into Baphomet?
No. I don't, again, there's a little bit of speculation on my part there. Well, not just my part, but people who do study it have drawn that continuity in belief. But it seems as though the knights during the Crusades had picked up some of this iconography, some of the legends associated with the ram god, and that it went to Malta, became embedded within the sort of sacred tradition of these secret organizations of knights, and then became embedded within the more Christian myth tradition of Satan, sort of the dark side. So I don't know much about it. There's a little bit of name association. There's a lot of iconography that seems similar. One of the things is that part of the annual ritual festival associated with the ram god at Mendes, that's talked about both in Greek texts, and I think we have some graffiti on it as well, is that there was a ritual of sexual intercourse between the ram god, the goat, the he-goat, and the woman. And so you have this tradition of bestiality, this relationship between the god and a woman, and I think that may have also influenced how people began to view the ram god in later centuries.
I think it's so important to have these kind of history lessons, because you rarely get this kind of broad scope of a situation, and I think so many people don't you know, like we were talking earlier about this idea of repatriating certain objects from Egyptian archaeology, and the Rosetta Stone really is a symbol of Egyptian conquering, and actually maybe Egyptians don't want it back because it talks about them being
I think they do want it back, but yeah, but it certainly is representative of, you know, Greek imperialism. And, you know, by the time you start getting into the later Roman period, of course, you know, the Greeks and Egyptians were now the ones, you know, dealing with the Romans. And so you have this layer of imperial, you know, hierarchy that get compressed in, and the Greeks and the Egyptians begin to blend together. In the aftermath of this, you know, as I mentioned, that, you know, it seems like the cult of Osiris was kind of on the outset of the rebellion to me. But the cult of Ptah was thriving, right? Because they're the ones who wrote the Rosetta Stone. They're the ones who declared Ptolemy V, you know, pharaoh. And Ptah is the major deity, you know, with the authority to do that. As, you know, even Alexander the Great, although he was the son of Amun, it was Ptah that granted him, you know, the right to be pharaoh. That you see priests of Ptah. We have one example of a priest of Ptah marrying one of the nobles from the Ptolemaic dynasty. So you have a Egyptian priest marrying into the Greek family. And so you start to see more and more of this type of intermarriage going on into the 2nd century BC with people who were at least in political favor. But there is eventually, you know, living together so long that they blend together, and I think at a certain point it becomes hard to distinguish in some areas Greek and Egyptian. And people will change their names too. You know, you might have a Greek name so that you could, you know, roll with the Greeks when you wanted to, and have the Egyptian name when you were rolling with the Egyptians.
Yeah, that would be nice. Jay, what's the film that's playing in your background? Gwyn asks.
Well, you know, I cheat because there's not a film about the Battle of Raphia, sadly. So this is the Battle of Zama in 201 BC at Carthage. So this is Hannibal versus Scipio Africanus, but it's Mussolini's propaganda film from the 1930s. But it's the only film I could find that had a lot of real elephants being used in warfare. So I cheated on that one. You caught me.
Jay, I can't thank you enough. That was so incredibly interesting, and I hope lots of people will watch this once I put it up. Maria just asks, was it in Timai that you showed the early Coptic church, and when will more excavation happen there?
Yeah, that's in Timai. It's a central building in Timai, and one of the men from the neighboring town of Kafir al-Amir told me that when he was a kid, that the tower that kind of sticks up that you saw, that he could actually climb up onto that tower, and he would sit up there as a child and look out over the site. But it's been degrading, you know, with ever more speed, you know, as the decades have passed. So we have a specialist in mud brick conservation, Marta Lorenzen. She's at the University of Helsinki, Italian. She's excavated with us several times. So she's just gotten a grant for work on that particular structure. And, you know, as soon as the pandemic's over, we've got a new permit going through. So we had to, you know, recycle our permit from last year because of the pandemic. So, I mean, theoretically it could be as early as the summer, but I'm going to say probably December that will begin. We did some reconstruction work on it just to reinforce the walls to stop collapse. But, you know, I can see that there are stairways going down underneath the building, that there are large chapels associated with it. You know, behind it, there's an alleyway about 30 meters back from the building where I found pieces of painted plaster, you know, from frescoes. So I suspect that what we'll find there will be quite phenomenal and insightful into the early Coptic religion. Timai was very important during the early Christian period, and the first two bishops of Timai were actually martyred in Alexandria. So they had converted to Christianity when that wasn't a good thing. And these were men of renown. They were wealthy, you know, elite men within Thmouis. But they were taken to Alexandria. They refused to renounce their religion, and they were eventually died in captivity or were murdered or executed in Alexandria. The third bishop became quite famous, actually, Saint Serapis. So here he's still bearing the Egyptian name, the Greco-Egyptian name of the god Serapis, Saint Serapion. But he became very, very important within the early Christian church, and wrote an important work, and attended, a synod in Byzantium and things like that. So, or Constantinople. So Thmouis was very important. And at the end of Thmouis is December 831 AD, and that's when Coptic Christians and Muslims rebelled against the caliphate that had occupied Egypt at this point, and a tax rebellion. And then there's a record of one final battle being fought in December of 831 at Thmouis, and that's the last that we really have a record of Thmouis in history.
Wow, that's so interesting. You really get a sense of the kind of on the ground history and the experience of people in that time, Jay. That was just so brilliant. Thank you so much. I'll let you go now, but that was absolutely great.
Yeah, and if there's other questions that you want to email over to me or anything, that's fine.
Yeah, I feel like we should just set up another session and carry on, because it's like endlessly fascinating. What's your favorite find from there so far?
Oh, well, I think I had a slide with a carved bone of Aphrodite, which I kind of think was like early pornography. She's so gorgeous. And then there's a gold ring with a dolphin, or earring with a dolphin holding a gem in its mouth. That was part of that hoard of silver I mentioned, silver and gold by the perfume merchant. Just the face on the dolphin. You want me to put the slide up?
Yeah, go on then. Is there any evidence of Minoan import or export there?
No, not for this period. I mean, Mendes would have been thriving during that time period, but Thmouis wouldn't really have existed in any way if it did. You see the slide?
Yeah, that's lovely.
All right, so this gold earring here, this was part of the hoard associated with that perfume merchant. And there's a little green stone in its mouth, and just the face of it's almost like a Disney kind of caricature of a dolphin. But it's absolutely just a gorgeous piece of jewelry. So that really is one of my favorites, because I just gold is always sensational to see, but just the workmanship on that, I have great admiration for. These actually, there's a series of 4 of these acrobat statues, and those are actually kind of sensational too, because it really surprised me that we found those in an offering pit actually in the Roman period. So those are pretty neat also. And if you go to the British Museum, there's a large marble of the same sort of thing of an acrobat in that pose. Of a marble statue. So I recommend going to the Hellenistic collection in the British Museum and looking at it, because it's a wonderful piece of artwork. And it's interesting just to think of the cosmopolitan nature of, here's this troupe of acrobats traveling around Rome, and they're welcomed with such enthusiasm, to have these performers to show up, across the empire.
Yeah, incredible. Thank you so much, Jay. I'll let you go now, but that was just great. And hopefully we'll do another one again soon.
Thank you, everybody, for your attention. And like I said, if there's questions or anything, be glad to answer them.
Thank you so much. See you later, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, Jay.
Bye-bye.